Welcome to Amintro Family, the podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Sammut. We hope you're enjoying the free online platform and community for family caregivers, be it through the Amintro Family app or amintrofamily.com. It's all about helping those caring for their aging parents, relatives, or friends and to connect and share experiences and access valuable resources. In this episode, we delve deeper into the Canadian Centre for Caregiving Excellence's 2026 Caring in Canada report. It draws on responses from more than 2,600 caregivers and care providers across Canada. And amongst the report's findings, and we'll give you a lot of numbers throughout this conversation, 59% of caregivers are employed, on top of having to provide an average of 5.1 hours of unpaid care every single day. Our guest today is James Janeiro, the Director of Policy and Government Relations for the Canadian Centre for Caregiving Excellence. James, we really appreciate your taking the time. Thank you.
Thanks for the opportunity to speak to you today.
Of course, thank you. Now, James, as you know, caregiving itself, it's a full-time around-the-clock job. You've done it, you know, professionally and personally. And many caregivers are having to work now to bring in money into the house.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the thing is, you know, Jeff, they want to work. That's one of the interesting findings of our survey is that many caregivers, as you say in your intro and you just said now, they are working. They're out there in the labor market, part-time, full-time, you know, many of them are out there with a job of some sort. And they're telling us that they want to work. They feel the value of work. To them, and it varies a lot, but for some, it's a form of respite, really, where it's the thing they can do outside the home, outside of their care responsibilities, where they get the validation that many of us get from our professional lives around our skills and our experience and the networking and the opportunities that come from that. But let's not kid ourselves. It's also about the money, right? They need to earn a living to put food on the table, to pay the mortgage, pay the rent, and God knows, pay for those care responsibilities as well, on top of the things that everybody else spends money on. So caregivers tell us, yeah, they're working. They want to work. They're not saying they don't want to work. What they need is support to be able to balance work and care at the same time. Because the impact of all that today is that about 40% of them, of working caregivers, told us that their productivity has suffered as a result of insufficient supports to balance work and care at the same time. If you really want to get pedantic about this, we can talk for an hour about what productivity means on aggregate for our economy as we're fighting this trade war. Happy to get into that in any kind of excruciating detail you'd like for your listeners. But this impacts both the individual caregiver waiting for that pay packet every couple of weeks, but also all of us collectively across the board.
Yeah, and let's not kid ourselves as well. I mean, half of us at some point here in Canada are going to be caregivers if we're not a caregiver already. So if we don't think it impacts us, it does before being a caregiver, and it will impact us when we eventually are a caregiver. More numbers, 17% said they had taken on additional work hours, 9% delayed retirement, 5% found second jobs in order to manage expenses. More to your point there. Are more caregivers needing to work primarily to offset rising costs associated with care?
So this is another interesting finding, is that you would think that caregivers with the highest care responsibilities, which is to say providing more hours of care over the course of an average week, you would think that they would be the ones working less. And actually, in actual fact, it's the opposite. They're the ones who are out there seeking more opportunities to earn money, in large part because of the cost of living reality that we're all living through right now. You know, you don't need to go much farther than your local grocery store every week to see the impact of that. I read in the Globe and Mail over the weekend that apparently tomatoes are the next thing for prices to start skyrocketing for a litany of different reasons. But there's a lot going on underneath all these prices at the grocery store that we see. Of course, the trade war with the United States, global trade markets, the Strait of Hormuz, there's a lot going on underneath the surface. But the reality is that the out-of-pocket expenses for caregivers are high and getting higher. We see it at the grocery store, we see it at the gas pump when trying to fill up our car. And across the board, those numbers are going in the wrong direction, which is to say they're getting more expensive. And about 20% of caregivers tell us that they're spending about $1,000 a month or more out of pocket on care responsibilities. So that's stuff like incontinence supplies, for example, or nutritional aids like Ensure and stuff like that, as well as, say, vehicle modifications or home modifications and stuff like that. And if you'll just indulge a nerdy point for a moment here, the baseline inflation for those kinds of products, that's all going up faster even than the tomatoes, the gas prices, the milk, and all that beef and all that other stuff, for again a bunch of different complex reasons. So these very same caregivers who are providing the most care, they're more likely, though not universally sort of guaranteed, to have more out of pocket expenses. They're feeling the pinch, and that's why they're working more, because simply they need to earn more money in order to keep putting food on the table and to provide care for the loved ones in their lives.
$1,000 a month. I mean, at $12,000 a year, you're not exactly finding that wedged in your couch when you get up after watching a bit of television. That's a
it.
hefty price, and a lot of people are not able to scratch that
That's it.
kind of money together.
And what's interesting is that this is the second time we've run this survey. We ran a slightly modified version of this 2 years ago. We released our report in 2024, Caring in Canada 2024. That's what it was called. So this is the second iteration of that. And one of the interesting underlying findings in this particular version of the survey is that cost of living issues and affordability issues have skyrocketed to the top of the list in terms of people's most important issues and the things that they worry about the most as caregivers, which isn't to say that these issues weren't important back in 2024 when we did this the first time. But the difference is that in 2024, we'd experienced inflation, we'd experienced a whole bunch of different things that were making some of the parts of our cost of living a bit more expensive. Today, we've experienced all of that, plus it getting more and more expensive at the same time. So these issues were just below the surface back in 24. It's now at the top of the list around caregivers' concerns.
So given that 65% of caregivers and care providers say caregiving issues are important to how they vote, do you expect caregiving to be more of a talking point during upcoming elections? And, we're talking to you, James, and you've served the government. You've served for then Ontario Premier Kathleen Wynne. Is this going to be more of a topical issue when it comes time to vote?
So I've spent my whole life in and around government, either having the unique honor of serving Premier Kathleen Wynne when I was her social policy advisor for 4 years, and before that a couple of other roles in the government of Ontario. And then since then, in on the advocacy side, providing advice and good stuff to government. So I've spent my whole career in and around government and in and around elected politics. That's the other thing, is that public policy, we live in a democracy, fortunately, a wonderful democracy about which we should be very proud. And policy in Canada is driven by democratic trends and democratic and demographic waves that come as things get more or less important to the voters come election time. And in the last few years, we've actually seen caregiving issues jump dramatically in both what voters tell us through our surveys is important to them, but also at the same time in the public discourse come election time. And the data point I'll point you towards is that in our last federal election, which happened just over a year ago now in 2025, and spring of 2025, all the political parties, major political parties represented in the House of Commons, had caregiving related commitments in their platforms. So that's Liberals, Conservatives, Bloc, NDP, Greens, all had caregiving responsibilities in their platforms. This was not the case one election before. It certainly wasn't the case an election before that. So in the few years, let's call it in the last 5-10 years, we've seen these issues reach the point of politicians talking about them come election time because they're hearing it at the door. They're hearing it when they go canvassing. They're hearing it in their constituency offices. They're seeing it in the polls. They're hearing it in the cases that their constituency offices are dealing with. So these issues are coming to the forefront more and more over time, because it's becoming a larger and larger part of Canadian life. And one of the many nice things about living in a democracy is that when our elected leaders start hearing an issue that matters to people, that's when we start seeing action.
Yeah, and partly why we do this show and why you're as outspoken as you are is because we've got to get people talking about this issue that is very important, and more to the point of the financial strain that caregivers are under. Another number that comes out of the Canadian Centre for Caregiving Excellence's 2026 Caring in Canada report is 20% of caregivers report having to stop saving entirely.
Yeah.
Now, that's alarming. The report calls for strengthening financial supports for caregivers, including expanding disability tax credits and benefits, paid leave programs, and direct compensation for family members providing significant unpaid care. So it hasn't happened to this point, but why? Why hasn't the Canadian government better recognized the needs of caregivers who are, of course, working around the clock to care for loved ones and beyond, and trying to, at the same time, stay afloat financially?
Yeah, and just to point on the savings is this is a troubling thing for both short, medium term consequences, but also long term consequences. So, short and medium term, that means that caregivers feeling that financial strain, they're not saving for a rainy day. So, if they lose a job, we've just entered a technical recession, says Statistics Canada. The unemployment rate is starting to tick up. If you lose your job as a caregiver and you've stopped saving, you've got less of a buffer to help you with that financial shock. Similarly, if you need an unexpected roof repair on your house or fixing your car or something like that, these are these kinds of shocks that happen in everybody's life at some point. And in order to be ready for them, you have to have some money saved away. And if you're not saving, you're not squirreling that money away to be ready for that financial shock that could hit you. But in the longer term, this also means you're not saving for your retirement. And our retirement security system in Canada makes certain assumptions about you as an individual having a certain amount of money saved up yourself for your retirement on top of your CPP, to which we're all eligible, CPE and any workplace retirement schemes as well. So that's a big assumption that our systems make now about retirement security. And caregivers, again, 1 in 4 of us, half of us eventually, telling us they're feeling the strain, not saving for the future. This is one of those ticking time bombs that if we don't address this before too long, could really become a much bigger problem down the line. But to your actual question, why haven't governments addressed this yet? Well, in Canada, I'll say I'm a proud patriot. I love my country, always have, served my country as best I can in different ways. In Canada, we have a habit of settling for second best, right? So we tend to be happy enough with good enough, and we don't pursue that leveling up of whatever thing you might be talking about. And one of the beauties of our country is that our ancestors built a healthcare system and a social services system to which we are all the heirs, and their successors and our colleagues and friends across the country work hard to support those systems and keep them going. But the consequence of that is that we've got these big systems that, for all of our complaints about healthcare and other things, let's not kid ourselves, they generally work decently well. And they generally, if you're there and you need help, generally, the system responds to you. So on the science side of our care systems, there is no better place you want to be in the world than Canada if you're in a position of needing medical care. And we should all be very proud of that as Canadians. I don't tolerate disparaging of our healthcare system because it's pretty damn great, if you don't mind a spicy word on your podcast. And we should be very proud of it and support it in a full-throated way.
Oh, sure.
But the other side of that equation, the care side of the equation, is where we fall short. Because we all assume, and our governments assume, that these systems we've built up and support and fund to the tune of billions of dollars every year work really well and are there to help us for all of our needs when we find ourselves in that situation. The reality, if you've lived this, is that that's not true. These systems were not designed for that. They're designed to provide medical care and social care for you when you're needed. They're not designed to be everything in your life when you're in that situation of needing care. And unfortunately, another reality of life in the 21st century is that many of our community and familial bonds are a bit more distant or more strained than there used to be. So all of these systems assumed, for example, in the early days, that you would have a mom, a sister, a granddaughter, usually a woman at home who's able to step up and provide care when somebody needs it. That's no longer the case. We now are blessed to live in a time when the gender wage gap is shrinking. More and more women are entering the workforce. We've entered parity or close to parity in that regard. So you no longer have that person at home whose job it is to provide care. And we're all working, which means we don't actually have extra time to provide that kind of care. So what we're really doing is trying to build up these systems to match that need that it has always been there, but the means that we used to use to provide that kind of care no longer exist. Some for very good reasons, like women entering the workforce, but others for frankly less good reasons, like community bonds fraying a little bit more, people not knowing their neighbor or living really far from their families and that sort of thing. So this is a convoluted way of saying governments haven't responded to this yet because really it's only in the last 5, 10 years that this has emerged as a major public policy issue that needs addressing. Because we think it's solved. If you're sitting in government, you kind of think it's resolved, but the reality is it's not. And unfortunately, change always comes slower than you want it to.
Well, I'm much more hopeful than I was 15 minutes ago before we started talking,
Glad
James.
to hear that.
When you're talking about how this is more of an issue in the latest campaign trails for every party here in Canada. So that's good to hear. What about recognition? Because again, 61% of caregivers and 54% of care providers do not feel supported by the government. So what does it take for a caregiver to be fully recognized by the government? Like, do you have to be a blood relative or married to who you're caring for? Because what if you're a boyfriend or a girlfriend or you're a best friend? You're not that typical blood relative or a spouse. Does the government recognize you as a primary caregiver?
So this is one of those areas where our systems, unfortunately, start to fall short, because the way most of our systems, healthcare, disability care, you name it, elder care, where that tends to go is either an emergency contact or a power of attorney / a guardianship arrangement, which is not the reality for most people. And being a caregiver is different than being an emergency contact. So there are very few parts of our system that uniquely recognize you as a caregiver, separate and distinct, as the person you call if say if there's a fall at the day program or something like that, right? So most of our systems don't recognize that. We're starting to see this happen more and more in other provinces across the country, where some healthcare systems, unfortunately, mostly at the provider level rather than the systems level, will start to take note of you as a caregiver when you go into the doctor's office. And the really, really good ones, mostly of their own initiative rather than a systemic response, will sit there and ask you, how are you doing, caregiver? What do you need? What can I do as your doctor, psychologist, speech pathologist, whatever? What can I do to make your life a little bit easier as a caregiver? And that is the consequence of recognition. If we figure out this recognition piece, then it's a lot easier to say, okay, if you're a caregiver, you are therefore entitled to these kinds of assessments, these kinds of supports, this separate and distinct policy response that should be there to support you separately from supporting the person that you're caring for. So in the absence of that recognition, which we haven't done a good job yet anywhere really in the country, in the absence of that, you don't get that kind of easy access to all these other things that we're trying to build up and that our colleague organizations across the country are trying to build up. And recognition can be as simple as an electronic medical record that your doctor is keeping anyway, having a little field at the top that says, James Janeiro patient, so-and-so caregiver, and then a phone number, right? So
Yeah,
a clear
it's on record.
recognition. Right, it's on record, exactly. And on to your point about do governments recognize this? Well, unfortunately, there's a pretty scattershot approach out there today to the kinds of things that caregivers would have access to, tax credits, programs, that kind of thing. Very few of them come with a clear definition of what a caregiver actually is, and consequently harder to get that recognition. The big one, of course, being the Canada Caregiver Credit. We've been advocating on this for a long time on this issue. You need a doctor to certify that you're a caregiver if you're going to claim this credit through the tax code. And one of the biggest barriers to people actually doing that is doctors saying, you know what, there's no definition of what a caregiver is. So therefore, I'm a little bit uncomfortable saying that James is the caregiver providing X hours of care versus Jeff, who's providing X-1 hours of care, and I, as the doctor, shouldn't be the one kind of just differentiating between those things.
Yeah, boy, it really is a more complex, difficult situation that you would look at from the outset. If only there was maybe some kind of like primary caregiver registration list or something
Right.
that was a part of a system that it's not entirely doesn't entirely fall on a doctor to be able to sign off on this. And I don't know, does that create even more red tape, even more hoops to jump through for a caregiver?
So one of the things that happened during COVID and stuck around for a little bit after was this idea of differentiating caregivers from visitors to a hospital or visitors to a long-term care home and that sort of thing. Now, during the dark days of the pandemic, that was a medical necessity to have that kind of differentiation because we all learned tragically the hard way what happens when caregivers are not around in care settings like hospitals, long-term care homes, retirement homes, and stuff like that. So in the maelstrom of that came this idea of literally, Jeff, a badge like that says caregiver James Janeiro to differentiate from visitor James Janeiro who's there to say hi to a loved one who might be in the hospital. So it can be as simple as that. It doesn't have to be complicated, right? Like it
Hmm.
can be as simple as in that frontline situation where the rubber hits the road, saying, I'm the caregiver, here's your badge, therefore, come and go as you need. Here's a room for you to rest in. Here's the social worker you can call if you need some help, that sort of thing. So it doesn't have to be just a giant system response. It can be a simpler on the ground response. And we learned some of that, like I said, through the pandemic.
Yeah, we certainly did. I learned that firsthand when my dad was still around and he was in a full-time care facility. It was um, before COVID and after COVID. And my mom visiting my dad, she was very well recognized as his primary caregiver because she would, if I didn't intervene, she would be there 7 days a week,
Right.
10 hours, 12 hours a day.
Yeah.
So she was around and she was recognized there by everybody. Yeah, yeah, that's Rita. She's
Yeah,
taking
right.
care of Emmanuel. You know, we know who she is. In fact,
Yeah.
they'd often peel back. We're understaffed. She's going to handle a lot of stuff,
Yeah.
which that is a whole other
Yeah.
conversation in and of itself. So maybe there's some other people that can sign off on this sort of thing and
Totally.
help with this badge system that would no doubt help. So in continuing the conversation in talking about government assistance and government help, the report recommends improving access to home care services and respite care, particularly for seniors and people living in rural communities where support can be inconsistent, difficult to access. I mean, heck, James, as you know, there are still some parts of this country that don't have access to clean drinking water.
Right.
Again, probably a conversation for another time. But how far behind is improved access to home care services and respite care for them?
Quite far behind. So
Oh,
the reality is accessing paid care is very difficult in virtually every part of Canada. So you can differentiate between urban and rural. Even in urban areas, like I'm in downtown Toronto, even here in Toronto, finding a paid care worker, like a personal support worker, PSW, for example, is not easy. There are a lot of hoops you have to go through, a lot of waiting lists. Even if you're paying privately, where you call up an agency to do all this for you, it's not quick, it's not urgent. Like there's no sense of urgency to it often, and you got to wait. And God knows it's not cheap.
mhm.
When you get out of the cities, it's all of that on steroids because
Oh,
you've got far fewer workers out there working in say rural areas or in the north, and wages are not good. Supply is not high, access is hard, wait lists are long, eligibility for subsidy programs is not easy to navigate. You can really bust your hump trying to get your local Ontario health team process going around getting some home-based care through that formal process, only for it to spit out, say, 3-4 hours of care a week when you desperately need far more than that. Okay, so the reality today is not good, hard to access, expensive, not enough workers, and so on. And if I'm honest with you, Jeff, we've also in many ways shot ourselves in the foot on this one, because demand for these services is set to skyrocket over the next few years. It is public policy that makes these jobs less desirable jobs. And I want to be clear here. So being a paid care provider, like a personal support worker, is a hard job. It is a very tough job. They tend to get dismissed as unskilled transient labor that anybody can do. That is not the case. If you spent any time with people doing this job, you quickly realize that this is highly skilled technical labor that is dramatically undersalaried. These people do not make nearly enough money for the work they do, and the jobs are tough. They're technical in nature, but they're also backbreaking in nature and heartbreaking in nature, because you're providing, oftentimes, really intimate personal care to people at the most vulnerable times in their lives, right? So let me give you, if you'll indulge me, just a little anecdote here for a second. So I was very involved in my late grandfather's care. Passed away. He died about 4 years ago now. He had a long, difficult battle with dementia and a bunch of other things. My grandmother, for whom I provide a bunch of different kinds of care today, but back then she was still alive. She was living at home, and she insisted she wanted him to stay at home until the end. That was a real thing for her. And Canada was very good to my grandparents when they immigrated from Portugal. They did quite well. It wasn't a question of lack of resources, so they had plenty of care. Right, as my grandpa was aging, but my grandma was still doing the bulk of it, despite being no spring chicken herself. But lots of PSWs coming and going in the house. And I remember one day during a snowstorm or something, PSW didn't make it to my grandpa's house in Toronto. And he was in pain, and he was screaming out in pain. For one reason or another, he needed to be moved. And in that moment, I get the call. You can't tell. I'm a giant. I'm 6'7", big guy, strong guy. And I live about a 10-minute drive from my grandparents, 5 if I speed, which that morning I did. I got in my car, sped down to where they live, close to me, to move my grandpa. And I had seen his PSWs do this hundreds of times. It looked to me, in my ignorance, as a question of brute strength, which I have in spades. Right? Like, it looked to me like that. It is not that. It is, as I said earlier, a technical skill. Moving somebody who's a big guy, stationary, dead weight in bed. It's a technical skill that I saw these PSWs do, despite being much smaller and not quite as visibly strong as I am. They were able to do it so often. I did it once, killed my back. And I'm still in physio all these years later.
Really?
Because of whatever I did that day. Now I'm doing much better, thankfully.
Yeah.
But it kind of literally crystallized for me in that moment that these are hard jobs. That's not a question of strength. It's a question of training and skill. So these are skill jobs that should be rewarded accordingly. But the pay is bad. Conditions of work are bad. And the part where we shot ourselves in the foot is restricting restricting newcomers coming to Canada to work in these fields through a variety of different public policy moves over the last little while has dramatically constrained the pipeline of talent into this pool. These jobs, as they stand today, Canadians by and large don't want to do them. Let's call it what it is. We have people coming from abroad who do these jobs, and public policy has constrained who can come into Canada and for how long to do these jobs. The effect of that is going to be a reduction both in the long-term supply of care workers, but in the short-term supply as people stop coming immediately or start to go home. So if we think the shortage is bad today, just wait before we start to feel the net effects of policy change in the immigration system. I apologize for going long about this one, but this is one that I get on a real high horse about.
No, and I appreciate the personal anecdote as well, and I hope you are feeling better as a result of what happened. 73% of paid care providers, such as PSWs, direct support professionals for people with disabilities, have considered changing careers, citing low compensation, inadequate staffing, and a lack of safety at work. Again, more to your point there. Now, the report also found only 13% of caregivers have received supports and services since we were talking about PSWs. Yeah. And that 13% is in the past year. Not blaming caregivers on this one because, they're just trying to keep their heads above water. But how much of that is due to a lack of awareness on the caregiver's part?
So it's a lot of it about to the tune of in a report about 20 only about 25% of caregivers actually know that this stuff exists. So it's a lack of awareness for
Wow.
sure because
That's
25 is not a
75% that
lot.
don't. Like three-quarters
Correct,
of
correct.
caregivers don't even know about how much help that they could be getting or could be asking for.
That's right. So then you have to ask yourself, why is that the case? And often it's because a lot of these programs are hard to navigate. They're confusing to read your way through. There's not a lot of promotion about them, and you really have to be in the know to know that this stuff exists. And that's where organizations like mine, and like, for example, here in Ontario, the Ontario Caregiver Organization, or Caregivers Alberta, or Proche Aidants New Brunswick, Caregivers New Brunswick, and others. There are six provincial caregiving organizations across the country. That's where these organizations are very important because they're closer to the ground and able to take a call from James saying, I've just become a caregiver. I don't know where to start. Can you help me? And these guys at least have access to the information to point you in the right direction of where you can start going down that road. But unfortunately, when you start going down that road, that's where you butt up against the real problem, which is that it's really hard to get in the door in the first place. And caregivers are working so hard providing care to the people that they love on top of their jobs, as we discussed at the beginning of our conversation, that they're sitting at their kitchen tables at 2 a.m. Googling furiously to see what they can find. That's not a recipe for success, right? So it's actually no wonder that these caregivers don't know what's out there because governments, unfortunately, haven't made much effort to promote these things that are out there. And if you don't make it easy to access, people won't hear about it and won't take the steps necessary to avail themselves of these things, even if they're in desperate need. Okay, so for example, the Canada Caregiver Credit, it's out there. It's not especially fantastic, but it's out there. Only about 9% of caregivers actually access it, even though it's there,
Wow.
for many reasons to do with exactly what you just said. They don't know about it, they don't access it. And as I said a moment ago, when they try to access it, they've got a litany of barriers that hit them in the face. So this is kind of low-hanging fruit. Is simplifying access to all this stuff would make an immediate difference to a lot of people.
You know, in thinking about the team of people that are caregiving for one person, and it has to be a team. Like I always say, like the worse the illness to the person you're providing care for, the bigger the team needs to be, from the primary caregiver downwards. And like your grandmother, for example, at the time, would have been better served, if I may say so, to delegate here or there. And I know I come from a European background as well. My mother,
Not strong delegators.
yeah, for a long time it was I'll do it, I'll do it, I'll do it. And I'm like, you
Yeah.
can't do everything, especially at your age. So
Right.
I look back at that team, and it was my mother, and she was right there as the primary caregiver for my dad, and she was just in the thick of it all the time. And I tried to provide as much care as I could to my father, but to my mother being
Yes.
the primary caregiver. And the support that I provided was, I'm going to get her out of the house. I'm going to let her go to church or go to the drugstore or do whatever she needs to do just to
Yeah.
get out of the house for an hour. I'm going to sit with my dad and I'm going to be with him. That's when he was living at home. And my sister would do the same thing. And I would do a lot of other things, groceries, what have you, you know. But my wife, her biggest job was paperwork, phone calls, planning, having a vision, being proactive instead of us being reactive. And I think about a team now for anyone that needs care. I think there needs to be somebody that just does that, does the Googling, does the calling, the emailing, the advocating, that just has to work on that person's behalf. You need somebody like that because, and look, I'm very lucky because I have my wife. I'm part of a family. I was part of a team. Not everybody has that. But
right.
if you are afforded that and you never know who might be of help, I think you need to have a person like that in your caregiving team.
You do, and the evidence shows that you do, because all of this is very hard to get through, and you need somebody to focus on what you actually can access and when, and the paperwork, the interviews, the timelines, the appointments, all that kind of thing. I quite literally make a living in the sector, right? Like I've been in and around the sector more or less my whole career, including when I was in government. And even with my grandpa, it was a struggle to do all of this. And I'm the guy who's supposed to know where all of this stuff is,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So the obvious answer is to make these, just generally across the board, make these systems easier to access. Okay, so I want to give a shout out to the federal government in the spring economic update that they tabled in April. They actually took a step in this direction with the disability tax credit. They named a whole bunch of new conditions that you no longer have to reapply for under the disability tax credit, and also added a whole bunch of medical professionals to the list of people who can certify your application for the disability tax credit. That's really, really, really good stuff. We've been calling for the government to do that for years, and it's exactly a step in the direction you're talking about making this stuff easier, less bureaucratic to access. So the easy answer is do more of stuff like that to make all of this easier to access. The reality is that's easier said than done. That takes time, that takes research, that takes effort. So in the short term, maybe we need some navigators out there whose job it is to help families navigate this stuff. So it's the Googler is the social worker that you get to call 24/7, or whose office you get to call 24/7 to point you in that direction, rather than you figuring it out for yourself. By instinct, I'm not a fan of that because it's just putting a Band-Aid over a wound. But sometimes a Band-Aid is better than nothing, right? So let's start with that while we figure out how to make all these systems easier to access.
I'll ask you this on the way out, and I'm going to anticipate the answer is yes, based on our conversation. Or maybe I haven't been listening as intently as everybody else out there. But the researchers behind the report argue that caregiving should be seen as a major social and economic issue requiring public policy across Canada. I would ask, are you hopeful that this is at least on the horizon?
I am. I have to stay hopeful for my sanity. I'm privileged to work on this professionally, and I get to see firsthand what our elected decision makers say and what governments are saying about this stuff. And I can tell you, in both my personal and my professional opinion, that the ship is turning. Governments are caring more and more about this out of necessity, because of political necessity, demographic necessity. Things are getting better. The trend line is on the way up. So we have fits and starts, but we have a commitment to a national caregiving strategy. We have a federal government who's listening. More and more provincial governments are listening. Things are happening. It will take longer than any of us want to fix these things, but things are happening, and better is possible. To everybody listening out there, I would say better is possible. Don't lose hope. We're already seeing improvements happen. And if you care about this stuff, as I do and as Jeff does, call up your MP, call up your MPP, and tell them you care about this issue and you expect to see action on making lives better for caregivers. And that you demand to see that come the next opportunity to advance these issues in those halls of power.
Well, James, I appreciate your part in pushing things towards that direction, or in that direction. I appreciate your joining us as well. James Janeiro, Director of Policy and Government Relations for the Canadian Centre for Caregiving Excellence. Really good of you to join us. We appreciate your insight, and on behalf of everyone here on the show, please thank everybody that you're working with as well over there with everything you're doing. We really appreciate it, and thanks to everybody that set this up too, James. Thank you.
Thanks for the opportunity.
All right. Thank you, James. I'm Jeff Sammut. This has been another episode of Amintro Family, the podcast, which you can hear on the Amintro Family app and wherever you listen to podcasts. Check out AmintroFamily.com. And a reminder, if we want to hear your stories on the forum, we can share them here as well on Amintro Family, the podcast.